d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, knight f3, short castle, h3, e5, d5, a5, bishop g5, h6, bishop e3, knight a6, bishop d3, c6, queen d2, king h7, short castle, c takes d5, c takes d5, knight d7, knight h2, knight dc5, bishop c2, f5, f4, e takes f4, rook takes f4, f takes e4, rook a f1, rook takes f4, rook takes f4, knight b4, bishop takes e4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop f5, knight c3, queen e7, rook f3, rook e8, knight g4, h5, knight f2, knight c2, bishop f4, bishop d4, king h2, queen e1, g4, queen f1, g takes f, knight e1, d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, knight f3, short castle, bishop e2, e5, short castle, knight c6, d5, knight e7, b4, knight e8, c5, f5, knight d2, knight f6, a4, g5, knight c4, h6, f3, f4, bishop a3, knight g6, b5, d takes c5, bishop takes c5, rook f7, a5, h5, b6, g4, knight b5, c takes b, a takes b, g3, king h1, bishop f8, d6, a6, knight c7, rook b8, knight a5, king h8, bishop, rook g7, knight e6, bishop takes e6, bishop takes e6, g takes 8, knight c4, queen e8, bishop d5, h4, rook f2, h3, g takes h3, rook c8, rook a5, knight h4, king takes h2, knight d7, bishop, rook g3, queen f1, queen 8, rook a3, a5, bishop e1, rook takes c4, bishop takes c4, bishop takes d6, rook takes a5, bishop c5, bishop e2, bishop takes b6, rook b5, bishop d4, bishop d1, bishop takes f2, bishop takes f2, knight takes f3 check, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, rook b1, rook g6, rook takes b7, knight f6, rook b8 check, king h7, rook b7, king h6, knight f3, knight c4, g6, d4, bishop g7, knight c3, short castle, e4, d6, bishop e2, e5, short castle, knight c6, d5, knight e7, b4, knight h5, bishop a3, knight f4, rook e1, h6, rook c1, g5, c5, f5, bishop c4, knight e g6, b5, b6, c takes d6, c takes knight d2, rook f7, bishop f1, g4, knight c4, bishop f8, e takes f5, bishop takes knight e4, bishop takes e4, rook takes e4, queen f6, knight e3, h5, rook c2, knight h4, rook ec4, rook e8, rook c7, rook e7, rook takes e7, rook takes rook c6, rook f7, queen c2, queen g5, g3, knight f3 check, king h1, knight d4, queen e4, knight takes c6, b takes c6, knight h3, bishop takes h3, g takes h3, queen c2, queen takes e3, queen g6 check, king h8, queen takes h1, bishop h6, d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g, e4, d6, knight f3, short castle, bishop e2, e5, short castle, knight c6, d5, knight e7, knight e1, knight d7, knight d3, f5, f3, f4, bishop d2, knight f6, b4, g5, c5, h5, knight f2, knight g6, rook c1, rook f7, c takes d6, c takes a4, bishop f8, a5, rook g7, h3, knight h8, knight b5, g4, f takes g4, h takes g4, h takes a6, knight a3, bishop d7, knight c4, rook c8, knight b6, rook takes c1, bishop takes c1, knight f7, bishop a3, bishop e8, queen c2, knight h6, g5, rook takes g5, rook c1, rook g3, bishop b2, knight fg4, knight takes g4, knight takes g4, bishop takes g4, rook takes g4, queen f2, bishop g6, rook c4, queen e7, bishop c3, queen h7, queen e2, rook h4, king f2, f3, queen e3, rook f4, g takes f3, queen h2 check, king, queen h1 check, king e2, bishop h5, king d2, rook takes f3, queen g5 check, bishop g7, king c2, rook f2 check, bishop d2, queen d1 check, king c3, queen a1 check, d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, knight f3, short, bishop e2, e5, short castle, knight c6, d5, knight e7, b4, knight h5, rook e1, knight f4, bishop f1, h6, bishop takes f4, e takes f4, rook c1, g5, e5, knight g6, e takes d6, c takes, queen d3, a5, b5, a4, queen c2, g4, knight d2, g3, knight f3, queen d6, knight d1, queen c5, bishop d3, knight e5, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, king 8, bishop f3, bishop c8, queen d2, g takes h2, queen f2, queen takes f2, knight takes f2, b6, king takes h2, a3, rook b1, f5, rook b3, king g7, knight d1, king f6, knight c3, rook f7, knight b1, rook f a7, rook d1, bishop b2, knight c3, rook e7, knight e2, rook e3, king g1, king g5, king f2, rook e8, knight g1, bishop d4 check, king f1, bishop e3, knight e2, rook a7, bishop c2, king f6, bishop d3, rook g7, bishop c2, rook e8, g3, rook takes g3, knight takes g3, rook takes g3, king e2, bishop c5, rook h1, king g5, king d1, h5, rook d3, bishop b3, bishop c5, king d2, h4, bishop d1, bishop d7, king e2, h3, king f1, bishop e8, bishop e2, bishop h5, rook b3, king h4, rook d3, rook d2, king g3, king e1, h2, d4, knight f6, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, knight f3, short castle, bishop e2, e5, short castle, knight c6, d5, knight e7, knight d2, knight e8, b4, f5, c5, knight f6, f3, f4, knight c4, g5, a4, knight g6, bishop a3, rook f, a5, h5, b5, d takes c5, b6, g4, b takes c7, rook takes c7, knight b5, g3, knight takes c7, knight takes e4, knight e6, bishop takes e6, d takes e, g takes h2 check, king takes h2, queen h4 check, king g1, knight g3, bishop takes c5, e4, rook a4, rook c8, bishop takes a7, b5, rook b4, b takes c4, bishop takes c4, queen h1 check, king f2, e3 check, bishop takes e3, f takes e3 check, king takes e3, knight takes f1 check, bishop takes f1, queen g1 check,